Please join us today on the roof of our school bus converted tiny home for what Bill McKibben calls a real cosmic adventure through space, time, and the human heart, as told to me, Kara Judea Al-Khadef, by my son Zazu, and illustrated by Micaela Amato, my extraordinary collaborator and mother. Let's jump in.
Wonderful. The book itself is startling, unique, striking. I can say I've never seen something quite like it. How does this technique, this approach, this narrative help to make such intractable subjects as corporate evil and the like personally relevant?
What I'm interested in is dialogue. And again, this being a fable for adults, and how do we use tales, parables, fables as a form of education, and how do we use dialogue then, not as we're coming from a top-down, this is information, data that you need to ingest in order to then take action, but how do you feel a sense of intimacy with these issues, with these realities of climate crisis and environmental racism. And for me, the endnotes and this intense annotation is really about highlighting possibility for dialogue so that people can feel their own sense of vulnerability and empowerment and see this back and forth between the sciences and the humanities, between deeply personal narrative and historical events that may seem unrelated to our families or to our daily lives. How do we find allies? How do we find bridges? How do we actually embody the potential for interconnectedness while maintaining our integrity as having very different ways of communicating, extraordinarily different histories, extraordinarily different passions, without trying to homogenize in order to come to a common or an imbricated common potential set of solutions. And again, the word solutions is problematic, but how do we actually embody unity within diversity? All of my work, since I'll say I was inflicted with the kind of anti-Semitism I was as a child, is about difference. And how do we maintain our separateness and find those potential spaces of connective tissue that are beautiful while acknowledging the unbelievable horror. And this goes across gender, across race, certainly across ethnic histories, across generational divides, across sexual orientation. How do we, and very much in this country, in the United States, across political separations, which we are now finding more and more are false separations. So how do we actually transgress the illusion of separation and use that transgression as a way to embody what we have determined as nature as separate from us, so that we no longer are in this false separation between ourselves as Homo sapiens and our natural environments. So that's part of the dialogue of crossing these multiple pathways, these intractable conflicts or allegedly intractable conflicts, in order to both find coalitional potentialities as individuals, as communities, but very much then how does that translate into our relationship to our natural environment, into the multiple ecosystems in which we're inhabiting, and how does our anthropogenic, the infrastructures, how can we begin to break those down by dissolving this illusion of separation?
Una mano lava la otra y las dos lavan la cara.
One hand washes the other, and together they wash the face.
One or two things I hear you saying are that if we revision our relation to our environment and our place in it, and also at the same time revision ourselves as one complete whole human community where there is not an us versus them mentality, then we can begin to address in a more holistic and effective way these dichotomies which are producing systematic environmental degradation.
Well, what is the intersection between the environmental degradation and the cultural extinction of ethnic minorities, as you said? What is the connection and the intersection of the two?
One of the main issues that we look at are people who are more vulnerable because of where they live. And certainly in the global south, for example, one of the issues among many others that the character encounters is environmental waste, is looking at the sacrifice zones, people who are seen as disposable, for example, and what does disposability mean? So issues of waste come up again in terms of both the human context and then the natural context, and how do we re-examine our relationship to waste, whether it's in a human context and seeing people as superfluous, which obviously in our extraordinary racist democracy, obviously many people are seen as disposable, and then and our relationship to objects as something that we can just supposedly throw away, and that there aren't implications when we throw them away. And the characters begin to understand that there really is no away, that both people and objects have all kinds of histories that affect one another directly, and this is all about relationships.
How can citizen activists actualize symbiotic solutions as we transition from our petroleum, pharmaceutical-addicted cyberculture to an economics of solidarity? How can we joyfully inspire, educate, and mobilize collective action among peoples of diverse backgrounds? Through an urgent commitment to creative waste collaborations, we can transform corporate capitalism's everyday violence, consumption, and entitlement, creating a bridge between infrastructural change and individual responsibility that gleans from indigenous wisdom and earth-based perspectives.
I'm looking at indigenous relationships to agriculture, engineering, architecture, not just from native peoples from these lands, but specifically Middle Eastern indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. Also, the characters visit southern India, the Caribbean, and North Africa. So looking at models that have existed for thousands of years, also in terms of healing and medical models that don't involve big pharma. It's divided into two sections. One is the image and the narrative, the first section, and then the second is about 400 endnotes of historical, literary, economic, environmental, science references. So it's a dialogue between the sciences and the humanities. And it's really about unlearning what we think we know and opening into the capacity of children's empathy and our own sense of empathy by seeing the connections between humanitarian abuses and ecological collapse, but then looking at cross-cultural examples of symbiosis, both among humans and then in our natural worlds, and seeing those as models.
On the front of your book, you say "as told to." Mm-hmm. Explain that.
So this is really a story about more than just a singular family. This is a story about humanity over the ages, cross-cultural storytelling. And the as told to is as though a child is speaking to his mother, is telling her his dreams that relate to the stories that he's heard growing up from his family members over the years about their experiences in various lands as a diasporic peoples. So the idea is not that I, as the author, am the author, but that I'm almost like a conduit and sharing the story of many through my son's experiences, through Zazu's experiences. So it's really about global voices, voices of refugees, voices of those forced to migrate from all over the world and across time.
An oral tradition.
Absolutely.
En mete cara, toma marido.
Those who take risks accomplish the most.
I want to describe for our listeners the appearance of the book because it's so large in your hands, and the illustrations are sweeping and florid, and often the text wraps around them. Your book has 55 pages of endnotes.
In his dreams, Zazu meets all kinds of time-traveling superheroes. Artists, scientists, healers, activists, and philosophers.
Every great dream begins with a dreamer.
The impossible missions are the only ones that succeed.
To sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards out of men.
He also encounters 21st century villains, big pharma, big oil, and agribusiness giants that stalk the planet, wreaking havoc on ecosystems and social systems.
So I see the relevance of how this could be used in a school setting for academic purposes, but how as adults could we use this book to actually educate ourselves or go using it across cultures?
I'm really glad you're asking that because that's key to this whole process, that we're really looking at the relationships between children and adults, between knowledge as something that's fact, supposedly, and scientifically based and objective, and something that's scientifically based and something that we embody. And I think that bridge is the bridge so much between children education and adults unlearning what we think we know. And this is how we're going to possibly work together, by learning from other cultures, by learning from our own pasts that may be not visible to us, and certainly by learning from the present from the natural world that may be shifting radically. So we need to learn now, and this really is a call for urgencies.
Symbiosis, empathy, communities, not corporations.
Amóstrate como amigo en la hora mala.
Act like a friend in difficult times.
Zazu Dreams is a multi-dimensional philosophical tale that transcends all barriers: ethnic, religious, linguistic, geographic, and chronologic. In it, wise animals and the likes of
Maimonides
pontificate Farsi, Arabic, Turkish, Ladino, and English interchangeably, effortlessly and seemingly without a trace of self-consciousness, making for a unique, freewheeling, and surprising narrative.
Your new book, Zazu Dreams, Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, it's chock full of fantastic historical information. One of the things I found fascinating about your book is the universally encompassing reach of it, ostensibly about Jewish history, but really not just about Jewish history, but the history of the whole universe. One of the great pleasures of this book, for someone like myself who grew up in Algeria, we spoke combinations of Arabic, French, Spanish, Turkish, Berber. One pleasure for me reading this book was the multitude of bits and pieces of languages that you employed in it. Ladino, Spanish, Arabic, Farsi, Hebrew, French, always followed by an English translation in parentheses. This is quite unique and unusual. Why did you choose to do this?
Again, that goes back to your first question about the multiplicity and the universality. The language of my family, the Sephardim, is Ladino, and Ladino is the epitome for me of multiplicity. It is a hybrid language. In the introduction to the performance that I give, and I can share a little bit more about that. It's a performance that I've been doing over the past year. I explore Ladino in the context of UNESCO's Red Book, in which they state that Ladino is what they call a seriously endangered language.
El prove y el rico, todo se mesura por un negro pico.
Whether you are rich or poor, you have the same grave.
Talking about an endangered cultural species for the Spanish, Sephardic, and Arab Mizrahi Jewish peoples who are not assimilated into the U.S. because of their Hispanic and Arabic culture, and that Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews share common histories with both Latinx and Muslim communities in the U.S. So I elicit the hybrid nature of Ladino as a way to address this idea that things are not black and white. Obviously they're not absolute. They're absolutely not absolute. And how then do we deal with those complexities? How do we take the language of storytelling in relation to the language of science, the language of contemporary media, social media? How does empathy fit into these languages? How do we identify truth in these languages when we're questioning or certain components of our society are questioning the truth of science, again, climate deniers. So all of these questions, for me, are implicit in the integration of using Ladino in the text.
Todo que tiene hambre, venga y comen.
Let anyone who is hungry come and eat with us.
Even your animals are sort of polyglots and interesting people. Your story is peopled by animals that talk, share wisdom, some of whom even are Jewish. Specifically, there's a certain Jewish parrot.
Yes, the Ladino-speaking parrot, yeah.
Yeah, Ladino-speaking Jewish parrot. You run into friendly whales. You even meet Ahab at one point. Magical camels are there as well. But one thing that intrigued me, what intrigued me was the omnipresence of the scarabs and dung beetles.
Yes.
So what's the significance to you of the beetles and the scarabs?
Two things. So in reference to the omnipresence of the animals, I would like to emphasize that humans are animals. I think we have very much, at least in U.S. dominant culture, we've forgotten that we are animals. And we do everything in our power with our obsessive hygiene frenzy to de-animalize ourselves. And the idea of returning to an indigenous knowledge base where there's a kinship with animals and there's a learning relationship with animals. So I hope to bring that out. And in relation to the scarab, so the title, the second part of the title, between the scarab and the dung beetle, going back to contradiction and or paradox, this creature, the beetle, had so many imposed meanings on it throughout history of both being reviled and revered. So where do we take this both and? What do we do with this position of the in-between? And specifically, for example, the dung beetle, and there's as you know, a very in-depth discussion of waste, and in particular, poop, the importance of dung beetles as cleaning. They clean the earth, just like sea slugs, in-depth investigation in sea slugs, cleaning the ocean and their relationship with coral reefs and what happens with pollution. And so looking at ecosystems, cultural ecosystems and biological ecosystems and the relationship, again, between humanitarian and ecological world. Where do they cross over? And the dung beetle is very much a part of that, which then slips into the idea of the scarab, and the scarab being worshipped, seen as a talisman, like the hand of Fatima or the evil eye, which is very present throughout the entire story.
How can we find solutions, relationships in unexpected places?
Can you give another example or two about this concept of unanticipated allies and solutions in unexpected places? A couple of concrete examples, perhaps?
Sand is another primary character. So each of these, amber, salt, sand, and poop, these each become characters in the book.
Some old whale friends told me that they saw swarms of dung beetles fleeing the North American continent because they could no longer bear to eat the poop from the United States because it is contaminated with GMOs, pesticides, vaccine ingredients and adjuvants, antibiotics in our food supply, hospital hazardous waste, flame retardants, lead-laden water. The dung beetles, who have survived for 30 million years, knew better than to eat what had become an industrial toxic soup.
Montañas lloran por aire.
Mountains cry for air.
Hablar quiero y no puedo. Mi corazón suspira.
I want to speak. I can't. My heart sighs.
Cuando sale la luna, nadie come naranjas.
When the moon departs, no one eats oranges. I'm in the high desert now. We don't have water. We don't have running water. We just moved here a few months ago, but we're building a water catchment system. And what I've learned about, I think, Colorado in general is that every drop of water is owned. So it's actually even illegal to do water catchment systems. It's phenomenally profound and perverse. And I'm so curious about the implications and also our ways of maneuvering as citizens in that frame. So I'm bringing that up because basically we're in the high desert of the Rockies, and what Zazu Dreams does is position examples, for example, from 9th century Iran and aquifers in particular climates, environments there, that we can then learn to adopt, maybe aspects of them, maybe fully, or looking at what happened in Michigan, Flint, Michigan, 2015 with the lead poisoning, and looking at that in relation to Turkey and coal power plants and the water contamination. And so it's this constant back and forth reference across time and space. So I talk also about quantum wormholes and quantum entanglements. You haven't gotten to that chapter, okay. But again, the simultaneity, I really want to emphasize the simultaneity. When we're looking at different cultures, different geographies, different climates, different ways of having a sense of intimacy with nature, of our understanding our own electrical beings in relation to interspecies communication, all of that, it's fertile ground for us to learn and to take action and not just go with the familiar. That's what, this Viscous Expectations in so many ways is about the unfamiliar, our unknown, not someone else's unknown. We learn from others. And that, again, requires humility and vulnerability.
I realized we had been traveling through a system of gnats.
Footnote 150. Gnats were irrigation technologies used over 2,000 years ago. Today, Iran relies on 50,000 gnats. Unlike massive modern electrical power, water pumps, pipelines, and dams that deplete stores of underground water and dry out oases, the ingenious, practical, and sustainable gnat method of harnessing limited water supplies is perfectly adapted to its arid environment.
Gnats have been dug into the earth to bring water from the mountains to the desert. Strange and bewitching patterns that remind me of constellations and mosaics.
This part of the Fertile Crescent was once known as the cradle of civilization. Now, many nations and megacorporations fight over ownership of water rights. Irrigation strategies that dam the Tigris-Euphrates benefit Turkish residents while they reduce Syrians' access by 40% and Iraqis' access by 90%. Must also recover from years of neglect and conflict. The result of these water battles is deepening, violent conflicts over water rights, not water shortage. There's plenty of water for all. As with our international epidemic of malnutrition, there's more than enough food in the world. The problem is not quantity, but rather distribution, infrastructure, and quality.
Across the Tigris-Euphrates Valley river systems we go. Since you found me in the spaces between the sand grains, I know.
Footnote 156. Sand grains are porous and permeable. The world's largest accumulations of oil and gas are found in the spaces between sand grains. Like Spinoza as a lens maker for the microscope and telescope, Rachel Carson was in awe of the simultaneity of macrocosms and microcosms, worlds literally between grains of sand. She tells our human senses that it cannot grasp its scale. A world in which the micro droplet of water separating one grain of sand from another is like a vast, dark sea.
Shalom, peace, is not about the absence of war, but it's about negotiation. It's about difference, you know? And for me, not owning a car or a credit card or smartphone is not about saying I'm doing something right and you're doing something wrong. It's about inviting in dialogue, inviting in a difference, because I don't obviously expect people to leave suburbia or their urban areas or wherever they're living and to move into a converted school bus and to repurpose everything, you know, from their DC refrigerator, their solar panels, or that's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I'm suggesting is moving beyond what we think is absolute. Like you said, give me some evidence. Instead, playing with the possibilities, reimagining, re-envisioning a future and present, simultaneous, by looking at our past, other cultures' pasts, our own pasts, if we dig into our own ancestral lineages and memories. I'm sure each of us have so much to learn and to contribute. So again, it's the simultaneous acknowledgement of past, present, future, individual, community, corporation, policy, to self-reflect, to be vulnerable, to ask questions, to collaborate. And it's not about knowing the answers, obviously. It's about, you know, being raw and saying, this isn't working, we've got to make some major changes, and not within the framework, the sustainability framework, the renewables framework, which imply economic growth, efficiency, the whole idea of efficiency, recycling. You know, you're doing it in order to do more. And what if doing more, I'll say one last thing, what if doing more meant being alive more? And that's not about sacrifice. You know, people often say self-restraint is sacrifice. That's not sexy. Who wants to sacrifice? You know, we like our comforts. What if it was about reframing and creating infrastructures that supported us so we didn't have to have comforts that relied on other people's hell? Hospitals, the medical establishment, just as one example, has become such, the big pharma has become such, the emphasis on power and greed at the expense of our bodies, where children are our collateral damage, again and again and again. That's one example. In terms of environmentalism, yes, certain rivers are not on fire, or lakes are not on fire, because Kodak is no longer dumping their photochemicals in the lake. But the pervasiveness of poisons, of toxins, in every element of our lives.
De la Barán lo improvisó mi padre.
Bargains aren't always bargains.
Levels of manufactured consent have reached such subtleties and pervasiveness. They're so insidious that our responsibility, and when I say responsibility, I don't mean some kind of punishing, you're responsible for this, or individuals are responsible, or shaming, but the ability to respond, responsibility, our empathy, that must be developed in order for us to see how our lives and how our quote-unquote comfort, our comforts are so reliant on other people's suffering and on the natural and on wildlife suffering at the roots of why the droughts and the floods were creating such phenomenal havoc in these people's lives. But the people I was there working for, the food aid people, it was all about Band-Aids. And those Band-Aids are killing us, and they will continue to kill us unless we begin to recognize that there are superficial ways of maintaining status quo, the illusion that the standard of living is one of wealth, and actually not seeing that we ourselves are radically impoverished in the way many of us are living our lives. Our impoverished lives, yes, morally, spiritually, structurally, in terms of spending time with our families, actually nourishing our bodies and our ecosystems through living in homes that aren't contaminated with buying a new couch and that couch is off-gassing, and where where were those chemicals produced? Solar panels, buying, my family can afford new solar panels in our 7,000 square foot house. And where were those what was the extractive mining involved? What are the minerals in the solar panels, let alone the infrastructure? And I just discuss all of this in my book, Zazu Dreams. Mm-hmm. But when we unpack those ideas of I'm doing it because I'm trying to do the right thing, or because it's trendy, because it's socially responsible, like you're saying, socially responsible corporations, we have to tease out the relationships and what we think is a given. It requires tremendous self-inquiry and a willingness to put ourselves in a position of analysis, of being grilled, but grilling ourselves in a way that's loving, though.
Absolutely.
Too. So I want to emphasize that also.
Well, some people, yeah,
is essential to this.
In the midst of this hopelessness, men and women reach out for the bread of hope. Then that is a quest for the bread of love. Everybody needs this bread. We need it in two ways. First, we need to learn how to love. The great problem of mankind today is still that there's too much hatred around. More than anything else, we've got to learn to love. In America, the white man must love the black man, and the black man must love the white man, because we are all tied together in a single garment of destiny.
What I would like to teach is not about minimum, it's not about less, because that whole scale is based on productivity. It's based on a framework of accumulation and based on a framework of haves and have-nots. So the whole idea of minimum, I just want to check, and part of our conversation, it has to do with language, right? Our language itself is compounding the very systems of oppression.
Certainly.
And when we think that we're living less or we're living minimally, when in fact the extraordinary abundance of what it means to actually recognize our interconnectedness, that is so overflowing. Really, I just want to highlight, because so much of the danger of these conversations is that people think, she's suggesting we go back and live in a cave, or a bus. And it exists among people and in nature and in history and in contemporary lives in a myriad ways. It's when we begin to make the connections, and then we can see, that way of living and that way of living and that interrelationship and that interdependency, all of those put together can create a map, can create a framework for us. And I would say exactly the opposite. It's all here already. Stephen Hawking, and he's one of the characters in Zazu Dreams. Everything we need to know is already within us, just waiting to be realized. Yeah. And that's very much of an indigenous concept, major cross-cultural indigenous concept, that it's here. It's a question of being receptive, of slowing down enough, of not participating in the systems that we think are just a given, to witness what does already exist, and then we apply it. You know, that's where we use our human intelligence, or our our capacity as whatever we are, as different from things that we have deemed as other. Mm-hmm. That's where we take our sense of responsibility and compassion, and again risk, and say, this is, the word radical means root. That's the Latin, and I think if we did that with a lot of our words, our language isn't inherently imperialistic. A lot of it, I think, a lot of it can give us some amazing insight when we look at the various Latin and Greek derivatives. English is an oppressive language in many ways, but in many ways, the answers are even just in our language. Mm-hmm. When we're looking at the roots of words. Oikos, O-I-K-O-S, is the root of eco. It's home. It means home, and that's ecology and economics. Economics and home in 2021? Very little intimacy between economics and home, except for, you bought a new carpet, or your new solar array. But how much of economics and ecology in the context of home could be re-envisioned together in small communities, and then have that become models for larger communities? We make up the macro. I mean, the micro makes up the macro.
Can you talk a little bit about the reception you've had to Zazu Dreams? How have people taken it?
Sure, yes. And thank you for referring to its lavishness. I love that, because as with my photographic work, I think the importance of excess and of redefining our relationship to excess is also key. That when we're looking at ourselves, our daily lives in relation to this category of environmental issues, it's not about sacrifice and reduction, but about difference, and that involves the lavish, that involves the lusciousness and sensuality. So I appreciate you bringing up the idea of lavish. In terms of its reception, again, the lavishness may, in a U.S. context, may be overridden by people thinking that it is a children's book. So that's the discomfort I have. In terms of the joys, it has been endorsed by extraordinary thinkers, Noam Chomsky, Eve Ensler, Paul Hawken, Bill McKibben, Henry Giroux, Antonio Yuhas, James E. Hansen in terms of climate scientists, Karen Barad, a number of philosophers and climate activists, the architect James Wines. So a number of public intellectuals and people on the front lines, Shakji Humpty Hump, the artist, the hip-hop artist, Rabbi Michael Lerner, people who are fighting against corporations like Dr. Stephanie Seneff, fighting against Monsanto, David Orr. They've all endorsed Zazu Dreams, and Arun Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, with whom I collaborated several years ago.
El mundo se manea, mas no cae.
The world shakes, but does not crumble.
Scholars, activists, and artists share their sense of playfulness, because the book is very playful, even though it's dealing with extraordinarily challenging but also contradictory issues in many ways, and to see how they responded to those complexities and contradictions in a very positive way.
Trust yourself, trust your intuition, and take risks by making unexpected connections. And in those risks of unexpected connections, we may find allies in unexpected places. And we need each other.